Welcome to another message from the Mercy Movement. I'm Vanessa Denha-Garmo, always joined by our foundress of the Divine Mercy Center, Catherine Lanni. Catherine, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And our guest today is Pete Burak. He's the director of ID, and he is a graduate of Sacred Heart Major Seminary with a master's degree, and you're a speaker often on evangelization and discipleship. Pete, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
So we've been centering a lot of these shows around COVID-19, what's going on in the world. And since then, we started these, we've had protests post the George Floyd death, which is very tragic situation going on in the country. But people struggle with this in different ways, Pete. And you have a lot of your background has been speaking to youth and young adults over the years. And, you know, what have you found in your experience of how the youth and young adults are dealing with what's going on in the world today, COVID-19, and now these protests? What has been your understanding of what's happening?
Yeah, in some ways, what we've seen with the pandemic and then with the protests is a little microcosm of my generation, in the sense of we are both very isolated and can be very isolated and very lonely and depressed and feel like nobody really knows us because we've the sense of community that has marked human history. When humans flourish, they're in a group, an extended family-sized unit that's really journeying together, a family on mission, right? That's when we thrive as human beings. And that's what the church exists to be, a family of families. And so as that has been lost in our society, my generation has felt the brunt of that, where social media gives us a false sense of connection, but we're really not deeply connected. We're not truly known because you can't really truly know somebody just through a screen. There has to be life on life in the process of that. And so in the pandemic, a lot of that feeling of isolation was exacerbated because now we actually are isolated. We're not even allowed to do so many of the things that we've grown accustomed to doing. So that was one massive challenge I think my generation was facing, is just all of a sudden those things that we all kind of knew were going on, isolation, depression, addiction, different things like that. Now the spotlight is on that, and it made it even more difficult. Then on the other side of the coin is our generation's desire for change, our generation's desire, very idealistic sense of what the world should be. And like any generation of young people, we want to do something about it. And so what you see in the best case of these protests, the peaceful protests, are people really coming together around a common cause that deserves attention, that deserves justice, and rallying to that. Young people, my generation, we want to follow something worth following. We want to follow someone worth following. And yet we've often been beaten down because everyone we've ever chose to follow has proved to have clay feet. And so it's been just an interesting time of kind of swirling emotions and feelings, because there's a lot to like about what the Lord has been able to do through some of these very difficult things. But then there's a lot of things that pose significant challenges moving forward.
You know, on that note, Catherine, when you hear Pete talk about the youth wanting somebody or something to follow, and they come to the Divine Mercy Center at different age groups, right? But we're speaking about the youth, and they come for healing. They come, the young adults, they come for what Divine Mercy Center is all about, the mission of healing and refuge. What do you say to them when they're desperately looking for something and Jesus is right here? You know, how do you communicate that?
Well, primarily, it's my own experience. And so, you know, it goes back to, you know, the time of Christ when Jesus would tell stories. People can relate to that more easily than any kind of directive or directions, especially with young people. Short of like, you know, high school or homeschooling or whatever groups coming in, usually young people will come into the Divine Mercy Center or chapel if there's something very serious going on in their life. Mm-hmm. So that could be rape, that could be sickness, it could be devastating family experience, and they're usually accompanied by an adult. Could be a parent, an uncle, aunt, whatever. So, you know, sharing my experience with God and, you know, the stories about other young people whose lives were radically changed, and then talking about God a little bit in a very short but natural kind of way. and trying to relate to them where they're at. And, you know, a big part of it too, I found, is helping to relax their fears. Because for the most part, there's so many young adults that are not catechized. And I hear it all the time from parents, to, you know, blaming themselves. I should have done a better job about speaking truth to them, relating, you know, and bringing God into our family situations. And, you know, I think young families especially, get so caught up in activity that, you know, church, Jesus, it's on the back burner. And it really doesn't become central to a young person's life until they're met with a circumstance. So the way I best communicate is through experiential things. And they'll listen, because it's a story about someone's life. They'll listen, and then, you know, just bringing it home from there. It's like, where are you at with God? You know, do you believe? Do you pray? And it's like, why? You know, yeah, I believe. And so, do you pray? And it's like, oh, kind of, not really, but, you know, it's okay. Whatever your prayer is, simple prayer, begin with that. You know, it's good. It's good. So just affirming them too, because there's so much in, you know, that is saying that they're not good enough. They're not measuring up, and don't even know if God loves them. You know, it hasn't been a priority until something comes up.
Yeah. To Catherine's point about fear, or youth that go to the Divine Mercy Center because something traumatic has happened. There's so much fear in the world today. And people are faced traumatic things when they have been discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or whatever it may be. How would you talk to young adults today on dealing with those fears and the race relations that we're seeing, the tensions between different races in the country today?
Yeah, no, that's a big, important, and complicated question. I would say one thing that's just been resonating with me is, you know, our work with ideas about helping young adults become intentional disciples. And so a disciple is modeling their life after the master, trying to become the master, in this case, Jesus, living as Jesus would live if he were you. You know, that old kind of cliche phrase, do what would Jesus do? It's like, actually, that really does work. I mean, that is kind of the appropriate question in all these circumstances. And so one of the things we've been trying to drill down into is thinking, okay, how would Jesus enter into these people's lives who are hurting, who are fearful? Well, he would bring healing. He would bring peace. He would bring joy. He would bring love. He would also bring the truth. He would listen, and he would direct. He would challenge, and he would invite. There's this beautiful balance in Jesus that we see in different episodes throughout the New Testament, where the woman at the well, he treats very differently than the Pharisees, but he treats both of them with love. Even as he's saying to the Pharisees, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and he's getting pretty intense, it's still loving action, because he's trying to shake them out of their malaise. He's trying to get them awake. Whereas the woman at the well, he's asking questions, but then he's also not afraid to be like, that's right, the man you're with right now is not your husband, right? And there's something that stirs in her, because not only does Jesus love her, but he truly sees her, he listens to her, and he knows her. And so as best as we can be representatives of Christ and really kind of be transparent vessels of grace, the better. And how that works with race relations, I think is going to be different for everyone depending on what the Lord's calling you to, but definitely trying to live the Beatitudes, to have, you know, righteous anger when appropriate, but not to sin, to still live in the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. All those things still need to be present in the heart of a disciple, even when there is real injustice and real things that need to change. And so we don't feel like there's necessarily a cookie cutter response to that, or cookie cutter, oh, if we can just check this box and just like, I don't think it's enough to just say, well, we just need to listen. It's like, well, no, we need to listen, and we need to do other things. I think there's too many times we put a but at the end of the sentence instead of an and. It's like, we need to listen, and we need to be able to speak the truth. We need to be able to say that, you know, Black lives matter and all lives matter. We need to be able to say that, you know, there is racism and there are good cops. We need to be able to say, there needs to be able to be an and statement, as much as, instead of all these but statements that end up causing more division instead of unity and harmony and hopefully a pathway forward.
Yeah, the word but negates, the word and unites. We
right,
kind
exactly.
of forget that. You know, Catherine, along with being the foundress of the Divine Mercy Center, you are a mother and you're a grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say from your faith perspective at the Divine Mercy Center and the mission of healing, right? What would you say the youth can learn from what's going on in the world, what they're experiencing between the race relations, the protests, COVID-19, everything we've gone through this year? What would you say that we can learn and glean from this, from a Christian and Catholic perspective?
Yeah. Well, the scriptures, throughout scriptures, it speak of government and governance and submitting to authority. And again, having balance in our lives. So I think just being truthful, and help pointing out, the good things in the world, and how the negative or bad things affect real people like themselves. How would you like if someone came over and kicked a hole into your, side of your car, or, and you didn't have anything to do with it? Those things, relative things that they could relate to, and how much people suffer because of it. That there are good people that get hurt when we aren't charitable, when we don't think about somebody else, getting outside of our own feelings and just turning it around. And knowing that no matter what we do, and even if we think somebody's not looking and trying to get away with things, that God sees everything. He really does see everything. And we should always behave in that light, because we're not going to get away with anything just because somebody's not there, or we're in a big crowd or anything. There's a good and noble thing about standing up for what is right and just. It's when we go beyond that to infringing on the security, safety, property, etc. of other people that we are in sin. And to help people in calling it out, the difference between right and wrong. And we don't like to hear it. People don't like to hear it, but we have to submit to authority because they're chosen by God. Nothing happens without God's permission. And so we might like some and not like others. And I'm not talking about abusive or sick situations. I'm talking about normal, healthy, governance. They have the authority from God to be in that position, and they need to be respected and submitted to, so long as nothing is going against, like I said, the person in a defective way or an abusive way. That's never good. So God calls us to that. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. It keeps ordinance. It keeps safety in society, and they're all put in there for that good reason. So throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, God speaks of governance and people living in a just way.
Yeah, Pete, I'm going to take that question, Catherine, and just take it a step further for you. We're all in different generations here. Me, you, and Catherine, we're all in different generations. I wasn't around in the 67 riots, but of course I remember 9/11, right? And you're going to, and Catherine remembers certain things in history. My family remembered when Kennedy was shot, and all these things that different, happens things in our life. But when you get older,
I remember the riots.
You remember the riots, and
but I do.
Pete, you're going to get older, and this is going to be a time that you're going to say, where was I when COVID, in 2020, my 2020 and my perspective. What are you hoping your generation will be teaching the next generation about what we need to learn from this day and age as Christians, as Catholics?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're experiencing that I hope is a lesson that is lasting is what's really important. And when so many things get stripped away, so many things that are even fun and good and beautiful. And I mean, I'm a big Michigan football fan as there is anybody. And the idea of not having a season this fall potentially is very hard on one level. On the other level, it's like, but is that really that important? And or where's the hierarchy of needs and wants and desires, and how do we properly orient our loves? I was just reading about Bernard of Clairvaux had this incredible line where he said the Lord brought him into the wine cellar and oriented all of his loves properly. It was just like, wow, Lord, do that in me. let me to know what comes first and what follows. And I think there's a way that this time has really revealed hearts as to the different idols that we've made, even out of very good things. And so I hope in 20 years we look back on this as an inflection point where people started to realize what is most important in life, and worked to maintain that even when quote unquote normal resumes, whatever that normal looks like moving forward. And I think those things that are most important are your relationship with the Lord. He's the pearl of great price. He's the one we're selling everything for. If everything else was stripped away, would he be enough? That's a great question to ask a disciple. If everything else was stripped away, is Jesus enough? And the answer should be a resounding yes. For me, I don't know if I could say a resounding yes right now. I think I would like to more of a peep yes, so kind of like a yes. I want it to be, but I'm on the path, right? And then family and friends and so many other things fall into place after that. And so the optimistic, hopeful side of me would say that this would be 2020 would be an inflection point. I think maybe the more realistic side of me says I'm just praying that it is, because I think there's a way that people rebound quickly to old habits and old perspectives very fast. And as much as we remember these big moments, history has a way of repeating itself too, unless we truly learn from it. And so I think as Christians, we need to kind of stand in the breach with the Lord and intercede for the rest of culture to say, let this warning even not go unnoticed, that this certain chastisement from the Lord, let it not just fall on deaf ears, but let it fall on soil that's fruitful, that can actually bear fruit moving forward.
Yeah. I have a last question for each of you, and I'll start with you, Pete, and I'll have you end, Catherine. We saw during the presidential election when President Trump was elected, this lack of coping mechanism for people who were so upset. We had colleges canceling midterms. We had kids being fed pizza and coloring books and Play-Doh because they couldn't cope. I mean, coping mechanisms. I think what's going on here is very traumatizing for a lot of people. They said PTSD might be a factor, because of what's happened with COVID-19 and the
Sure.
protests. But as Christians, when we talk about coping mechanisms, and I'll start with you, Pete, what does that look like? How do we cope in crisis? And what's considered a real crisis is what we've gone to, or what's not considered a crisis, but something people just couldn't deal with about who our president is. You know what I mean? Those kinds of things, and putting those things in perspective from a Christian lens, from a Christian perspective. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, from the Christian perspective, I'm not sure we really believe in coping.
Okay.
We believe in thriving. We believe in life to the fullness that comes in and through Jesus Christ. In good times and bad, I bless the Lord. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That the deepening of our relationship with Jesus is such that ideally we get to the place, as Catherine of Siena described it, where there's a storm on the surface of the water and there's calm, cool waters underneath that are unaffected by the storms of life. Would that it be so that we would get to the point where we are so unified with the Lord that it doesn't mean suffering doesn't happen. It doesn't mean aren't challenges, but they are seen through an eternal lens. And we could actually get to the point where St. Paul says to die is gain, right? Like he's not trying to cope there. He's got a bigger purpose. He's beyond the need to cope. I mean, you read the lives of the saints, and every possible suffering that comes their way, they see it as this opportunity for holiness, and they see this opportunity for the salvation of souls. They see this as an opportunity to offer it for the world. And so I think if we're trying to cope, I think that becomes a self-reliant thing and a self-indulgent thing, as opposed to putting our hope and our trust on the rock that cannot be shaken. And so if we're in this mindset that I just need to survive this, then I think we need to switch our mindset from the Lord is never just asking us to survive. He's always giving us the grace to endure, certainly, but to thrive in the midst of that. No temptation is greater than what the grace has been given to overcome it. And so I think we're selling ourselves mightily short and actually becoming self-reliant and probably prideful if we think, the things of this world and my own abilities are going to be enough to sustain me through a difficult time. The fact is, there's nothing in the world that can help you cope. There's nothing in the world, nothing inside you that can help you get through this outside of Jesus. And so he's really the only one, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, that we have the potential to live an abundant life, especially during difficult times.
Amen. Catherine, same question to you.
Well, I say that's why it's so critical for parents and grandparents and people in the world that know God and love Him, really go out of their way to relate that to the young people, experientially especially. They hear that and they listen to that rather than book knowledge or preaching or something like that at them. And having an open heart. And I mean, I have 13 grandkids, but with my own 3 children and son-in-laws and stuff, when things come up, it's bringing them to that point of, where God is at in their life, and, how to turn to Him for the graces, because it's exactly what he was saying is like, it's not about coping. God doesn't want us just to, keep our nostrils above the water. He wants us to really, even in these things, to have joy in knowing, and we can have joy because we know that God is in control and that he's going to lead us. He's going to take care of us. And so having great peace. And it's been amazing through these times. I mean, we were inundated with calls and, what's going to happen? Is this the end is this the end? And aren't you afraid? And it's like, it was funny how people of great faith, people that had, were actively, even if they're far, but at some rooted in God, had a relationship with God, let's say that, they really weren't afraid. They were unsettled, they were whatever a little bit, and that's normal, but there wasn't that fear of spazzing out, like, is this the end? And how am I going to live? And where am I going to toilet paper now? And it's like all these crazy things. For God's sake, that's the least of the problems. Really drawing the kids in, and adult children as well, and telling them, hey, we got through so many other things, God has always taken us through them. Nobody's starving, and whatnot, and be thankful, and for His graces, because God will walk us through step by step until we come out.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, Pete, for joining us here on another message from the Mercy Movement.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, Director of ID. How do we find you?
intentionaldisciples.com. And then we're all over all the different social media platforms, but intentionaldisciples.com.
Amen. Thank you
Look
so
forward
much.
to listen to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine, as well as always.
You're welcome.
And thanks all for joining us here on the Message from the Mercy Movement. We'll see you next time.